Hi again then guys, and welcome to the very first installment of the first brand new series on the channel of 2020, HyperStars. And for those who are wondering, which is of course most of you because it's a new series, the idea behind this series is similar in some ways to Unsung Heroes. Because for those who don't know, Unsung Heroes is designed to shine a spotlight on the forgotten cars of time, cars which sometimes succeeded but more often than not failed, but deserve more attention because they had interesting or oddball ideas. This series is similar to that in terms of it being kind of an appreciation series, but it's much more subjective to me because I'm going to be specifically talking about cars which in some cases may be far better known than the majority of Unsung Heroes, but I believe for very specific reasons deserve more respect, more accolades, and maybe even more love in many cases than they actually have, because these cars go way beyond just being there on the market. They actually did achieve things which many people maybe haven't thought of or weren't aware of. And the entire reason why I chose the LISTER Storm to be episode 1 is for that exact reason. It's a car which many of you have already heard of, it's a car which many people love, many people dislike for fairly obvious design reasons. I get it, I personally like it, but I could see why you'd dislike the design. It's certainly unique and one of the boxiest supercars ever built. It makes a Ferrari F40 look curvy in comparison. But the reason why I wanted to talk about the LISTER Storm is because it's a car that often just gets lumped in with the, oh yeah, that's cool kind of group, where people don't necessarily give it the credit that it deserves. And the reason why it deserves more credit is actually based on quite a few things. And two of the most crucial things to bear in mind when talking about the LISTER Storm's importance to the supercar scene are the place and time from which it comes. England in the early 90s. Now, the early 90s worldwide was an interesting time for supercars. You could argue that many of the cars that became legends at that time paved the way much more literally for the supercars of today than any that came before them. Your Bugatti EB110s, Ferrari F40s, Porsche 959s, and of course, McLaren F1s. And crucially, one car which I know many of you do love, a car which many people who grew up at the time certainly adore the design of, and even I will give it the respect of saying that yes, from concept to production, it was one of the most authentic cars ever produced, the Jaguar XJ220. Because the reality of the LISTER Storm is you cannot fully appreciate why this car is so good without discussing the XJ220 as well. And the reason why I say that is because, and this will be controversial, the LISTER Storm is in many ways the car that the Jaguar XJ220 should have been. And I don't necessarily mean that Jaguar should have built a boxy four-seater supercar. Although, let's be honest, that kind of sounds like something Jaguar would do. What I mean is actually more technical than that, because although many people today don't realise it, the XJ220 was actually one of the worst marketing failures of any supercar ever built, and for a while it caused a colossal slump in its used value. Now it's up again today, it's up around £3, £4, even more £100,000 to buy one, but for a while you could literally pick up an XJ220 in certain car magazines, and I still have issues of those magazines, for about £90,000 to £110,000, which is insane to think of these days, and quite the investment for people who owned one at the time. But the thing is, the XJ220 promised people the literal world. It was going to be the British Veyron before that was even a thing. It was going to be a bigger deal than the McLaren F1 ended up being, because Jaguar promised the most technologically advanced, arguably prettiest supercar anyone had ever seen, with an in-house Jaguar V12 all-wheel drive and performance like you couldn't even imagine. And consequently, many fans and many potential buyers put down huge deposits for XJ220s. And we all know what ended up happening. The car did not have all-wheel drive, it had rear-wheel drive, it has the rear-view mirrors from a literal Citroën, and the engine is from an MG Metro rally car. Now, don't get me wrong, credit where it is due. It was the fastest car in the world, even despite that. But it was the fastest car in the world for about 10 minutes. And the top speed did not live up to the name anyway. I believe the official record was actually something like 213 miles an hour, not 220. But regardless of that, the point was Jaguar simply didn't deliver, and many of the people who put down their deposits justifiably wanted them back. LISTER, on the other hand, kind of ironically ended up using a Jaguar V12. So how difficult could it have really been for Jaguar to put their own V12 into their own car? I'll never really understand the politics of that situation. Could they really have not just worked with Lister to produce the XJ220? Well, regardless, what we ended up with was a car which, if this had been Mercedes and Chrysler instead of Jaguar and Lister, would have simply never happened. Because, again, for those who don't know, the SLR McLaren caused the death of the Chrysler ME412 because it would have been overshadowed by a mile. Now, a similar thing I would say happened kind of with the Lister Storm, at least from an accolade point of view, because what many people don't realise is that even though the XJ220 was indeed the fastest car in the world for a time, the Lister Storm was actually also the fastest car in the world, but in a different way. Because even though the Jaguar went for the outright record, which it achieved, the Lister actually had the more niched record of being the legitimate fastest four-seater car ever built. Over 200 miles an hour with 4 seats, a genuine practical supercar, and in my opinion, one of the best practical supercars ever built. Yet, the Lister Storm, and this is what many people don't think about or realise, actually retained that record for over a decade. How many supercars hold speed records for that long? Even the McLaren F1 barely managed a similar amount of time before the Veyron took over, and even the Koenigsegg CCR before that. So the Lister Storm actually is a remarkable record-setting car, and when it was finally beaten, it was only beaten by the Brabus Rocket, a car which was over 20 miles an hour faster, so it took a huge deal for somebody to finally beat the Lister Storm at what it had achieved. But even beyond that, that choice of Jaguar V12 wasn't just ironic, it was incredible, because it didn't just happen to be a Jag V12 that they used for the sake of being buddies with them. It was actually the biggest V12 engine ever fitted in a production car since World War II. That's nuts in its own right, but even more so than that, it wasn't just any Jaguar V12, it was the same basic engine design that Jaguar themselves used to win the Le Mans 24-hour race in 1988 in the XJR9. It's a literal Le Mans engined supercar that also had 4 seats and retained a world record for over a decade. Now, the price tag on the Lister Storm, at least from what I could find, was not quite as insane, but it was still very expensive, over £200,000, which in 1993 was crazy money. About a third of the price of a McLaren F1, which doesn't sound that bad, but the McLaren was even more insane in terms of price, but of course, that one tended to be more favoured by history. Now, ultimately, only 4 of these Lister Storms were ever built. There were a couple of others in racing forms, and there was even the ultra-rare GTL road car, but only 3 of them apparently remain today. I believe one is black, one is silver, and I think one might be red. But it's the kind of car that when you see it, it's like seeing a literal unicorn, and I've been fortunate enough to see a Lister Storm in black in person at the Goodwood Festival of Speed, and of all things, it was parked only a few cars away from the only road-registered TVR Speed 12 that exists, the W112 BHG license plate red one, with the GT body kit. That was, for me, quite the moment to take in as a huge fan of both of those cars. But to get back to the Lister Storm, the reason why I think it is such an undervalued car goes way beyond those things. Yes, it has a fantastic engine. Yes, it has an incredible world record, which many people don't give it credit for. But also, its design, whether you like it or not, how many supercars can genuinely say that nothing else on the market even looks close to it? A genuinely, authentically unique looking car. There aren't many cars which can really claim that. Many cars, in fact, can end up even being somewhat derivative of each other, but that wasn't the case with the Lister Storm. Like it or not, there is nothing else that looks like it. Nothing else that's really even tried to, and certainly nothing that the Lister itself copied that came before it. But even beyond that, it's not just the design, it's the quality as well. The kind of car that this could have easily become. A car with some cheap knockoff wheels, fiberglass body, pathetic interior with plastic everywhere that just centers its entire sales pitch on a great engine. The antithesis of the XJ220, in fact. The polar opposite. That is not what the Lister Storm did. You look at the interior of this thing, you look at the way the body is sculpted, such a difficult shape to realise and make it look legit and not disproportionate. This car was developed with a ton of care, engineering prowess, and you wouldn't expect any less from a company like LISTER with so much racing experience as well. It's a car which could have easily just been a cash grab riding on the coattails of the XJ220. But not only did it not even attempt that, it was a legitimately completely different idea of a supercar, one of the most unique supercars ever built, even to this day, and I think a car that, even among those who love it, it doesn't necessarily get the kind of respect and the kind of accolades that it actually deserves. I would argue the LISTER Storm is actually one of the best and finest all-round supercars ever produced. And speaking to its main selling point of practicality, how many supercars, even up until today, can genuinely claim to have 4 proper-sized seats, not just 2 token seats in the back for people with no legs, and great trunk space as well? It's a car that you can actually use on the street. Plus, it's, as far as British supercars go, pretty much the unicorn of all unicorns, with only 3 of them still existing, as I said, and even though it didn't necessarily dominate racing like the McLaren F1 did, the fact that a car that initially weighed about the same as an SLR McLaren could go racing at all is pretty impressive in its own right. In many ways, you could even argue that the LISTER Storm achieved in 1993 what Bentley didn't even try with the Continental GT until about a decade later, and yet, for some strange reason, the Bentley tends to get a lot more love and has still stuck around even till today. Now, LISTER have rumoured that they're interested in bringing back the Storm in some form, and I am, of course, all for that. But to me, as great as the new one is, it probably won't be as intangibly awesome of a unicorn as this original one was. A car which I believe does not get the credit that it deserves, a car which I've always loved, and a car which is at the same time so uniquely polarising from a design point of view, and yet so unarguably impressive from an engineering point of view. But that's it for my thoughts on the LISTER Storm. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode, and I would certainly like to do some other select episodes here and there for other cars in the future. But tell me your thoughts on the LISTER down below. Do you love the car? Do you hate it? Are you kind of like me with the Nissan GT-R, where you have more respect for it than love? As I said, tell me about it down below, and of course tell me if you would like to see more episodes of this series in future. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.